Good morning, everyone. We're continuing our conversations about the end of life. Today, I want to talk a little bit about grief and what happens, how you can help people who have already passed, and how we can help ourselves after someone we love has left this world. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, guide us and bless us. Help us to understand these deep truths, which are often very challenging to our human hearts. So help us to understand how following the divine way, although painful and difficult at times, leads us to the only home we really have, which is not clinging to the changing things of this world, but to surrender joyfully to the freedom of living only for God. Om, peace. Amen. There's a story that I've been telling a lot lately because it's somehow, these things seem to have cycles. At least that's what I've noticed over decades on the path, that issues just keep whirling around, and certain incidents, especially from Swamiji's life or from Master's life, just have a depth of instruction in them that just, at least my mind, I just keep going back to them over and over again. The incident I'm thinking of right now is the time that Swamiji was talking to a group of our sadhaka devotees. It was, he over the years, he spent many days in the community of Palo Alto, and sometimes he would not do any public programs. Sometimes he would do a big public program, sometimes private satsangs. It just depended on why he was here and what his inclination was. From that particular visit, he gave a satsang for all the sevaka members, then a satsang for all the sadhaka members. Sevakas are people who live in the Ananda community. The way we sort of say it is they're devotees who are in the army, which is they have the karma to have more or less surrendered their preferences to the needs of the community. That's not as draconian as that sounds, because we're not under obedience, we're under cooperative obedience, which means that both sides of the equation get to be taken into account. Sadhakas are devotees who may be equally dedicated and sometimes even more dedicated in the sense of who can say. But the karma they're living out in this lifetime requires that they also be loyal to perhaps children who have a different destiny, a spouse, a career that's important to them, financial responsibilities. So they're not able to make their first and only priority serving the community in an explicit, defined, this is the community's need way. They have to serve God in a broader, sometimes less obvious form. So it's a very subtle difference, and it's not always clear to everyone. So when Swamiji was willing to give one satsang for the sevakas and one satsang for the sadhakas, when he was on his way to do that, on his way meant at that time we were living in an apartment, 100 yards from here, 50 yards from here. And actually the satsang took place in the house where I'm living now. Those are just geographic details for the few of you. So we came over here to give the satsang. On the way over, he said, "What should I talk about?" to the sadhakas. I said, "Swami, there's a lot of confusion sometimes because the differences are hard to see, and people feel like are they second-class citizens if they're not sevakas, if they're sadhakas, and people can't even remember which name belongs to which group, and it gets really goofy. So why don't you talk about what it means to be a sadhaka? So then Swami sat down and gave one of the most moving satsangs I've heard him give, which is why this always stays in my mind. And at that time, which I don't know when it was, maybe in the 90s, late 90s. Actually, I have no idea, but I think that's when it would have been. He wept in public, which he rarely did then. At the end of his life, all you had to say was "Guru," and he would burst into tears. But in those days, it was very odd for him to cry, very notable for him to cry. And he was telling us about the fact that after he was thrown out of SRF and was living with his parents, his father gave him one of the cars, the family cars, to use, and then eventually decided, since you're using this car all the time, which Swami was, he was going to the new Kamaldali's monastery in Carmel to stay sometimes, and then he was going up to San Francisco to give classes, and so he was using the car all the time. So his father said, well, I'd like to just give you this car. And it was impossible for Swami to say no, because it was just impossible for him to say no. It was generous of his father, and also it was appropriate for Swami to take responsibility for the automobile rather than leaving that with his father. Then, and furthermore, Swami couldn't explain, because his father had no understanding of Swami's spiritual commitment, and Swami had just been expelled from SRF by his Guru Bhai, so the whole thing was not looking real attractive to his dad. And so Swami had to just say yes with gratitude, but privately, he was absolutely heartbroken. He'd become a monk at 22, and a few years later, 6 or 7 years later, he'd taken a sannyas vow. He'd become a Swami. Sannyas vow is not a small vow. It's the absolute commitment to repudiate all the things of this world in favor of living for the divine. It doesn't feel like a loss to the sannyasi. To the sannyasi, it feels like extraordinary freedom to be cut loose from these unbearable burdens of this world. I can't speak with the power of Swami, but I can stand on the edge of the pond and talk about what the water looks like. Swami was swimming in the deep end. I was still sort of am. I just kind of have my toes in the water. But he had gone all the way in that spirit with extraordinary joy. And he said, now I had to own a car. And it just, like, I understood what he meant, and I think some people did in the room understood what he meant. It's like he had to step back into the world. And he just could hardly bear it. It was, of course, grief upon grief because of the expulsion from the monastery, which had catalyzed the need and the grief of being expelled. All the things were there. So it was many things that made him weep. But he just said to us with tears running down his face, I can't begin to express to you how painful it was to realize I would have to own a car. And but he accepted it, and so on. So then he finished this, and then he wept. Tears were going down his face, and he had to stop. And I mean, even after all those years, it was still like it had been 30, at least 30 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-90s at least. Yeah, 30 years. And he gathered himself together. And then he sort of turned to me and he said, well, have I talked about everything I should talk about for this satsang? Because he'd asked me to tell him. I was such an idiot. I said, well, Swami, you could talk to people about what it means to be a sadhaka. Because he hadn't even touched it. I mean, he hadn't even said the word. At least as far as I could see. He hadn't explicitly touched it. He just looked at me with extreme seriousness. And again, this is why these moments are emblazoned on my soul. He said, that's all I have been talking about. And he was talking about it by contrast. Just he was trying to express what absolute renunciation looks like and what absolute renunciation feels like. And each of us, we can't just say I should be at the top of the mountain, therefore I am at the top of the mountain. We have to be completely comfortable, committed, and determined at where we stand. And what would happen with sadhakas is they would chafe against the restrictions of their lives. I mean, I chafe against the restrictions of mine, and I'm a Sevaka life member and a Nayaswami, and I still am responsible for a house and all sorts of things. We just can't. We don't get to put it down. But anyway, Swami said, that's all I have been talking about. And then he said to the room, don't even try to live the way I live. He said, you could never do it. He said it just like that. You could never do it. And it wouldn't even be appropriate for you to try. It's still, you can see why I keep contemplating this story. You would think, well, it should be appropriate for me to try. No, spirituality grows like a seed from inside. And you can't insist that the sapling, produce a great crop of apples. It's just a sapling. It's not even appropriate to ask the sapling to make apples. It can't do it, and it's not the right step for the sapling. Well, in the context of all that we're talking about just letting go of the realities of the life that we've lived and have to face in with pride, appropriate pride, with satisfaction is probably the right word, with satisfaction to all the good that we've accomplished in this life, and with just complete peace and equanimity about what we're not able to do. I've had conversations with friends of mine, one man in particular, who made himself kind of crazy, trying to live a life that was beyond him, trying to not own a car because he shouldn't want to own one, I mean the equivalent of, because somebody said he shouldn't want to own a car. And it was so funny when we compared notes about it, because his life had been very tempestuous and a lot of hard things had happened. But God bless him, and I commend him with my whole heart. He never gave up, and eventually everything came around to what it was supposed to be. Just had to do a little remedial to build the foundation appropriately. Let's see. Oh, but I said to him, in essence, but I wanted a car, so it never occurred to me that I should try to give it up. It's like it never crossed my mind that teaching applied to me. I didn't even hear it. It just went whoop right over my head like that. I mean, that was to my credit that it did. Not that by no means, I'm quite vulnerable to this, which is why I can speak about it. But we just have to be at peace with who we are. And there's no reason not to be, because God is at perfect peace with us. It's we who create this maelstrom of confusion all around us. Well, I was going to talk about grief and dying, but I might as well move a little bit more into that just at the moment. It's always been a confusing thing to me. I mean, our society is so out of step with truth. We have a society now that is just completely wrong about almost everything. You have to really, we have to really dig deep into that thought. It's completely wrong about almost everything. I know when Swami Kriyananda, when some of the teenagers in the community, this was at the time when Michael Jackson ruled the world. He was just so popular everywhere. And some of the teenagers in our community realized that Swami had never heard any of his music, knew nothing about him, and they thought this was a great lack in Swami's education, so they gave him some CDs or whatever you passed out in those days, and Swami was allowed to listen. So he did. He dutifully listened. And Swami's so open. He remarked, he said that Michael Jackson, the phrase he used was a consummate artist. In this sense, he knows exactly what he wants to say, and he says it perfectly. And that's why, and then Swami said, and the vibration of what he puts out is exactly the vibration of where the world is right now. That's why everybody in the world loved his music. You would sort of, these things sweep across the planet and everybody gets excited about them and you kind of wonder why. Because it's not the forms of things, it's the vibration of consciousness that that form represents. And his vibration of consciousness put across, Swami said, perfectly in the form of music was exactly where everybody was vibrating. So the world just was swept right into that wave. He was born for the time he lived in. Of course, then his life disintegrated a little bit, but there he was. Elvis Presley was another phenomenon like that. Frank Sinatra. It's often musical entertainers because music can cross over language, culture, and all of that. And there's other world phenomena. I'm just not in touch with it. But Swami's comment was, it also helps Swami to understand that he is totally out of tune with the vibration of the world at this point. Now there are a tiny handful compared to the billions on the planet, a tiny handful who were very in tune with Swami, and that's who he was creating for. But he was creating for the future, not for the present, because that's what avatars do. I'm giving another class series about Christ, and today happens to be a Monday, and it's on Wednesday the 15th or whatever the Wednesday is, the 16th. And I'm going to be talking about Jesus, the lost years of Jesus, which is Jesus in India. And there's a certain amount I can say about it. But the real message is, why were those years taken out of the Bible? And why are we finding out about them now? Jesus lived, 2,000 years ago. And key elements of his influence are only now being uncovered. Like the impact of these spiritual beings, the long range rhythm and the view. Jesus and Babaji have planned the spiritual salvation of this age. They're very concerned about what's going on and they're working on it. But they're not working on it so that it's going to be fixed by the end of the year. They're working on it. Jesus is still working on it after all this time, because the bond to the disciples is eternal and the compassion is never ending. So what we have to understand in this subject of death, especially, just the world is crazy, especially the Western world. Western world is really nuts. In India, because I was working on the class for Jesus and Jesus in India, I was looking for pictures because the records that are there about Jesus have him going to specifically the Himalayas, Varanasi, and Puri, the Jagannath temple in Puri. I'm sure, he was many other places. He was in India for 18 years. So I'm looking at Varanasi and I'm just looking for pictures. And there's a picture of the cremation ground in Varanasi. Cremation ground is right on the bank of the Ganges. It's out in the open right there. And as tourist pilgrims, anybody can just walk right up to the cremation ground. And the cremation ground is a pile of wood with somebody's body placed on top of the pile of wood, and the male relatives, standing around watching the body burn, and then doing certain rituals, and then over there somebody else is doing it, and over there somebody else is doing it. It's absolutely out in the open. And you'll see in the city of Varanasi, and now I'm giving my Wednesday class. If you come, you're going to have to listen again. It's absolutely out in the open. And you'll see just processions of people with a little stretcher, with somebody all wrapped up, lying there like that, and the relatives just carrying the body to the cremation grounds, setting it afire. It's just right there in front of you. Now, it doesn't mean that people aren't wailing in grief, but the whole thing is just happening right before your eyes. I remember when one of my friends died, and I was present for her death. And she died in her home here in this area. And after she died, it's like in India, the people themselves would prepare the body, depending on where. India is becoming very Western too, but in certain parts of it, people would prepare the body, and the relatives would pick up the stretcher and carry it to the cremation ground, and the oldest son would light the fire. I mean, it was just all done by the people. Here, a phone call is made, a big black hearse pulls up. These young men come in black suits and black ties and pretend to be grief-stricken because they have to honor the mood of the family. I think to myself, they're probably with the windows down and the music on coming over because this is their job. So they and they put the body into this body bag and zip it up and put it on a gurney, take it out. I'm standing there with the husband, now the widower. We're watching them, and he's a humorous fellow. He says, "No, there's a job I wouldn't like to have." It's just like, what a job. And that's the last we saw of her. It was over for us. She was buried, not cremated. It wasn't an open casket. Maybe she was cremated. Yeah, I think she was cremated, but we never saw it. We never saw the flames. We never saw anything about it. That's not good, is what I'm trying to say. It's not wholesome. I mean, it's far more wholesome, and many people nowadays are more participating in it. But we have to not be afraid of these things. We have to really not be afraid. And on a much deeper level, we have to recognize that death is really important for the person dying. And it's also really important for us. Love is eternal. Friendship is eternal. Swami writes in The Path, that we form these long relationships, and these relationships go on and on. Not every biological relative has a deep karmic connection to all his relatives. So just because someone is a sibling or is even a mother doesn't mean that it's a profound, important relationship for everybody in the family. But you will have those profound, important relationships that may also take particular forms. But it's the relationship that's real. It's not the form of that relationship. And if the friendship is real, we have an unselfish attitude toward people. So when their time is done and they need to go on and do something else, we have to support them in that, not rebel against it. And it's understandable that we miss people. It's understandable that we have loved that form. When Master gave the funeral for Sister Gyanamata, his most advanced woman disciple, who he said she was fully liberated, and he watched her merge into the light. But when he was giving her eulogy, speaking of her at her funeral, he wept. He wept because, as he said, we'll never be Sister Gyanamata and Yogananda again. It was a beautiful moment in time, and now it's over. And naturally, the heart, it's a tribute to how wonderful it was that the heart feels a tremendous loss now that it's gone. But that loss has to always be balanced by the requirements of true friendship. Now, Sister Gyanamata was liberated, so there was nothing that Master could or couldn't do that would affect her consciousness. And of course, he was united with her in spirit. But most of the people that we love who die, some of them may go into perfect freedom, but most of them are continuing their journey. Sometimes I've tried to express it like this: if you raise a child and the child has an expansive, adventurous spirit and decides to go study in another country and leaves home and goes off and then writes you letters from Paris and all the things that they're experiencing and they're doing. You have two realities at the time. One reality is, oh, it was so nice when they were under my roof and I could see my daughter every day. And letters are nice, but oh, I wish, I was with her or she was with me. That's only natural. That's human. We can't try to live a life that isn't ours, just like Swami said. But at the same time, every time you talk to your daughter on the phone, you don't want to just make the whole phone call a weeping, wailing, cry from your side about how much you miss her and how miserable your life is without her. I mean, what kind of love is that? You want to cheer her on. She's going forward. Your duty has been fulfilled, and now she's striking out on her own. And isn't it magnificent? And yes, of course, honey, I miss you. It was nice when you lived here. But isn't it wonderful? Tell me again about that's what you do when you love someone. Death is exactly like that, except we can't talk on the phone. It's worse because it's over, and that has to be faced. So grief is natural. But there's a point at which, and I've only, now it's the end of my talking, and I'm only just touching it. Grief is natural, and we have to be sincere. We have to be sincere. But we also have to be unselfish. And that's the tremendous challenge that comes, isn't it? And the question, and I was starting to say all of these topics I'll have to continue tomorrow. When my father, my parents really, but my mother passed away a month after they moved out of their home and moved into a care facility, because my father was memory impaired. My mother just basically moved my father in, got him settled, and 4 weeks later she left. So he was perfectly settled by the time she was gone. But there they are in this memory care unit, and my dad wasn't as far gone as some, but he was notably. My father was wonderful, because what my father forgot was everything that he had to worry about. And what he remembered was all the reasons why he was fundamentally a kind and happy man. And so for the last couple of years in his life, he was just a very kind and very happy man, because all the anxiety for some reason just left him. It was perfect. But in the memory care unit, they make a tremendous effort to help these people keep connected to the things they've forgotten. There's all these pictures of all their family on the wall, and they're constantly trying to make them hold on to that which is slipping away from them. And of course, there's nothing, I wouldn't touch it for anything in the world. But is that really the best way to do it? The Indian concept is, at a certain point, you just walk away into the forest and you go live in a forest ashram. And no matter who you were, you forget it, because you're about to have to go anyway. You really start your life review in a major way. In the Mahabharata, that's one of the things that happens at the end of the war, is that the older generation says, okay, now you guys are settled. We're gone. And you consciously say goodbye before you're ripped away. And we don't follow such a dramatic, we may not follow such a dramatic path. But consciously saying goodbye and saying to your elder grandmother, if we were just sending her off to the forest, we would say, go deep, Grandma. Get close to God. We love you. We'll see you again somewhere in the spirit. But for now, I'm so grateful for all you gave me. Now, go. And that's the balance point we have to find when someone we love leaves us. Now, that's only an introduction, because there's much more to say. So I'll let it rest there, and we'll pick it up again tomorrow. God bless you.